Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction and indeed the invitation to come and speak this morning. As most of you will know, of course, there is a substantial body of music for viol consort that involves the organ as well. But I found during my researches that very few people really understand what a consort organ is, and that includes professional organists as much as it does viol players. So I wonder whether it might be interesting just to take a quick straw poll to kind of break the ice to start off. Among those of you who play the viol, I wonder if you would mind raising your hands if you have played at any time any of the repertoire for viol consort with organ with any kind of keyboard. So who has done that? So quite a few. This is encouraging. Very good. Thank you very much.
You could ask keyboard players if they played with viols.
Oh, well, that's another question altogether. I wonder if I can ask the same question, but now, how many of you have played the viol consort repertoire with organ with a pipe organ, as opposed to anything else? Fewer hands, but there are still some. Now, we would expect some of our more esteemed members to have done that, but less common amongst those of us who play in a more amateur way. And now the real nub of the question. I wonder once more if you could raise your hands if you have ever played that repertoire with a genuine English 17th century consort organ. And there are far fewer hands, just two. And this is, I think, something which I will return to towards the end of our session this morning, because very few people really are familiar with these instruments and know really quite what they're like and what they can offer you as viol players. So this talk would be rather different if I were giving it to organists. So what I'm hoping to do is to show you as viol players the advantages of rediscovering the sound of the consort organ. My work towards this began many years ago, thanks to Maurice Rogers, many of you will know, invited me decades ago to play in a concert with one of his ensembles. And I rocked up, as many people do in these circumstances, with a Yamaha keyboard under my arm, with a sort of vaguely organ-like sound in it, and did my best, as so many people have done before me and since. But what puzzled me about it particularly was how odd the music was that I saw on the page in front of me. It was really unlike anything else I'd ever played. And at that point, I'd played a fair bit of 17th century solo organ music, and I'd done a certain amount of sort of continuo playing in general terms, sort of Baroque and earlier. And yet this was palpably different. And it piqued my curiosity. I wanted to know, why is this music so odd? Why does it do things that other kinds of keyboard music doesn't do? So I went to the literature, and at that time there was very little written about it. In fact, the only thing that I could find really was that marvellous article of yours, Peter, in that book that you co-edited with Andrew about John Jenkins. And there Peter explored some of the questions that were burning in my mind and answered a few of them, but also, interestingly, posed quite a few of his own at the end of it. So I thought there was more to do here. So to cut a long story short, I embarked upon a PhD thesis, which I completed 5 years ago. And that led me to some of the answers, but not necessarily all of them. Since that time, I've rewritten the thesis as a book, and now comes the most nerve-wracking moment when I have to change the first slide. Oh, it worked. Marvellous. And added a chapter which talks about the other important role of the consort organ, which was in vocal music domestically. And that's coming out at some point next year. It's part of the Ashgate Historical Keyboard series. So forgive the unashamed plug, but one has to do these things. So we're going to start off by meeting our first consort organ. And it's quite a famous one. It's also one of the oldest surviving ones. So there it is. This is an organ which is now in America. It's in Smithfield, Virginia, as part of a thing called Historic St. Luke's, which is a kind of living history museum. It's a bit like the Weald and Downham Museum just up the road from here. And it focuses on British colonial life in 17th century America. And in the museum, they've put the organ in the church, which is really quite the wrong place for it. It really should be in the house, because the first thing to note about domestic consort organs is that they're very different to the 17th century English church organ. Now, of course, they share some of the technology, the pipes, and some of the gadgetry in the background that makes it all work. But beyond that, there are a huge number of differences tonally and in concept. And Similarly, these organs are also very different to the contemporary 17th century continental organs of that period, which tend to be kind of scaled down church organs. And they're also very different to the 18th century English chamber organs that succeeded them. So I like to think of it in much the same way now we think of virginals and harpsichords. And again, they share the technology of jacks and strings, but in a way they're two completely different types of instrument. They have different uses, or they did originally, different repertoires, different contexts in which they were played. So in the book I argue the case for the consort organ as a kind of sui generis instrument, an instrument in its own right, not to be confused or just associated too much with the church organ. And most histories of the church organ in England focus on the liturgical instruments, and instruments like this just get mentioned in footnotes or, if you like, a paragraph or two. So my book is hopefully a chance to sort of bring the consort organ back to its rightful place. Now, if we look at this organ, we know that obviously it isn't originally American. It spent most of its life here, which some of you may recognise as Hunston Hall in Norfolk. And this, of course, was the home of the Lestrange family. The Lestranges were very keen amateur viol players, and they operated for quite some decades in the 17th century. Amongst their staff, during the early years of the Civil Wars, they numbered John Jenkins, who was resident there, and wrote quite a large amount of music, a lot of it incorporating the organ for the household. They also had a resident organist who was a chap called Thomas Brewer, and his hand can be found in many of the Lestrange manuscripts, which some of you may be familiar with. The Lestranges bought their organ in 1630, and it's not ideal for looking at detail, I'm afraid, in here, but there we have the entry in Alice Lestrange's household accounts, a pair of organs, £11. Now, in 1630, £11 was quite a lot of money, but for an organ, it was an absolute bargain. So that poses a little bit of a mystery. By comparison, the Dean of Canterbury bought an organ very much like this one, just the year before from Burwood of London, and he paid twice as much for it. So why is it so cheap? It's possible that there was another payment that doesn't appear in the accounts. I suppose that's always a possibility. It may be they were very lucky and got a bargain. But my personal theory is that it was second-hand, and there are a number of things about the organ that suggest that. One of them was the fact that one of the first things that Nicholas Lestrange did with his organ when he bought it was to take it to bits. He labelled all the pipes in his very distinctive handwriting, took them out and sawed the top off them. And what he was doing there, of course, was to raise the pitch by lowering making them shorter, the pipes raise in pitch. So he's bringing the organ into line with the pitch standard that was established at Hunston Hall. And that to me suggests, among various other sort of circumstantial sort of organ things, that it was in fact a second-hand instrument, and therefore predates 1630, which makes it even more interesting than it already is. So in this case, we've got this wonderful sort of concatenation of things. We've got the instrument itself, we've got the context in which it was used, we've got lots of repertoire that was played on it, and we've got some of the characters who were involved with it. And this is Sir Nicholas Lestrange with this fabulous wig. At least I'm hoping it's a wig, or assuming it's a wig. I quite like one of those, it's rather splendid. But they are, when you get this sort of combination of things, instrument, music, personalities, context, there's a lot you can learn by connecting them. And fortunately, there are several instruments from the 17th century like this that we can do this kind of thing with. So let's go back and have a closer look at the organ itself. It's quite an early type, so it's what we call a table organ. It looks as though it's sitting on a table, but in actual fact, this is a purpose-made stand for it. But other organs of this type would have been a little more self-contained and would have sat on a table to be played. On either side, we've got doors there, and they are painted with biblical scenes. One of them is Jephthah, and I forget who's on the other side. But it reminds us of the fact that although the main sort of raison d'etre of these organs was in, certainly to start with anyway, in string ensemble music, they did have other roles, and in many households they were used for devotional purposes. Singing psalms and other sort of devotional works was a common pastime alongside string playing. Of course, when you close these doors, this looks just like any other cupboard. The keyboard and all the fancy pipework at the front disappear, and it becomes an anonymous piece of furniture. And certainly when we get to the time of the Civil Wars, that was a very useful thing, because of course organs like this found their role at court, and that royalist sort of origin became controversial as time went by. And a lot of the aristocratic households in the orbit of the court adopted court procedures and practices, bought their own organs like this. There were times, of course, where it was useful to be able to hide that. And so many of these organs, when you close them, just look like ordinary pieces of furniture. Open them up, of course, and you get this wonderful sort of cabinet of curiosities inside. And the curious thing about this organ in particular is this curious trompe-l'oeil effect. So you've got this false perspective. It's actually flat, but the pipes are painted so that it looks as if you're peering into a hall. And if we have a little close-up view, I don't know how well this will come through, it's not too bad, you can see that this is entirely a painted effect. So we've got the mouths of the pipes down there at the front, and then this rather fun false perspective effect. And there are a couple of other organs that enjoy this kind of effect from a similar period. If we take those front pipes off, however, we can start to see the innards. And this is where we find another very characteristic feature of the consort organ. All of that pipework is made out of wood. And that's important because it has two effects. One very practical effect is the fact that it stabilises the tuning depending on varying temperatures. Metal pipework expands and contracts, so the pitch goes up and down a little, whereas wooden pipework is much more stable. And that's handy if you're living out in the sticks somewhere wild and vastly away, something like Hunston, for example, where you don't have access to an organ builder very easily. You want an organ that will just look after itself, essentially. But the other point of wooden pipework is it changes the sound that the pipes produce, everything else being equal. And whereas the majority of church organs of this period used mostly metal pipework with occasional wooden ranks, consort organs were mostly wooden throughout the century. It was only towards the end of the century that metal pipework started to be used, but then only for a few ranks. Now, wooden pipework imbues a particular sound to the organ. And if you take the pipework out and lay it out, we can begin to see some of the peculiarities that relate to consort organs' pipework. The pipes themselves are very narrow in relation to their length. So in organ speak, we say they're very narrow-scaled. And also the holes at the front, the mouths of the pipes, normally on a pipe they would be sort of more or less square, roughly. But on these pipes, they're barely slits. And in fact, on the pipes on the left-hand side, the mouths are so small that they're hardly a millimetre high. Now, this is really pushing the technology of pipe voicing to the limits. And there's many examples in these organs where you can see that they've taken pipes out and started again, thrown them away and had to begin again, in the pursuit of this very particular type of construction. So why did they want that? Well, if you produce pipes like this, you produce a kind of harmonic profile to the sound that, certainly in the lower harmonics, emphasises the odd-numbered harmonics. You get a very distinctive sound. It's a slightly sort of edgy, slightly scratchy sound compared to the fluty sound that we more normally associate with, particularly with chamber organs. And this sound was sought after because it was similar in general shape, harmonically, to that of the viol. If you've ever studied viol or violin acoustics, you'll know that those harmonics are the ones that tend to be prominent. So the organ builders were not trying to make the organs sound like viols, because that's impossible, but they were trying to make the organs blend with viols. And this is an important point to emphasise, really. When we think of the first use of the consort organ that we know of in the late Tudor, early Jacobean periods, we find it in works like those of Ferrabosco the Elder, for example, where the organ doubles everything that the viols do. Now, Ferrabosco was working at the court and he had professional players, so he doesn't need the organ to help them keep in time or to keep in tune. why then do we have the organ just doubling everything? Of course, people think, well, you don't need the organ, let's just omit it. And of course, the music will stand on its own to some extent without the organ there. But what they were looking for was the tonal combination, I think, of viols and organ. The two homogenized, they kind of blended together into an imperceptible sort of sound where you can't really tell what's viol and what's organ. Now, of course, those of you who've practiced playing with modern pipe organs, the sort of box continuum organs we're used to today in early music, will know that's really not what happens. The voicing of those organs is very different to that of the sound of the viol, and so it sticks out. It's palpably, discernibly different to the sound of the viols. But it gets worse because modern box continuum organs have a lot asked of them. So you might have a unison stop, an 8-foot stop that is quiet enough to play with your viol consort. It might not blend with it very well, but at least it's roughly in balance. If you start adding more stops on those sort of organs, they get significantly louder. And that's because they're designed to be working with perhaps an orchestra at one point or a choir at another point. You can then draw out another stop and it gets significantly louder still. And that's because there's a load of people behind you singing Alleluia or whatever it might be. So these organs are designed to be sort of factotum instruments that do everything to all men. Whereas the consort organ was designed for this very particular purpose with strings. So when you add extra stops on a consort organ, it doesn't actually get that much louder. It actually brightens the tone a little bit. But most importantly, it doesn't overshadow, doesn't blot out the viols. So we think that registrational changes, adding stops, taking them away, will used much more freely than is really possible on using modern organs today. To help with this, not the clearest picture, I'm sorry, but just to the left of the keyboard here, there are three levers. They're vertical, and they sort of go like that. And the movement of those is very small, but barely half an inch. And because they're so close to the ends of the keyboard, you can just whip your hand out and just change your registration very quickly. So in the context of somewhere like Hunston Hall, where Nicholas Lestrange, as you will surely know, was very keen on humouring the music, on expression. He writes here how they varied dynamics and phrasing and all sorts of other things which we are generally taught doesn't happen in viol music. The organ could play its part in that kind of role as well. And there is some evidence for it from not so much contemporary to the Lestranges, but certainly 17th century observers. Here is this quote from Roger North. If you can't read it, it says, "Organs and espinets do not so well soften by degrees." In other words, they don't crescendo and diminuendo very well, but with a skillful hand and variety of stops, perform it tolerably. So organists in the consort context would use registration to change dynamics a little and to enhance the expression with which they are able to contribute. And of course, today with a modern box organ, you can't do that because as soon as you add a stop, it's game over. It's just blotting everything out. So with just a small number of stops, there are actually a lot of registrational varieties that you can explore. And I've put a few here for the three most useful stops that you find on these organs in consort context. And you can see that there are, just from those three, 7 possible varieties, if you have flavours, that you can get from the organ. And this is enhanced by the fact that in many of the organs, the keyboard is divided into 2 halves behind the scenes mechanically. So you can have a different sound in the bass to that in the right hand in the treble. And with that, you can do things such as, for example, enhance the treble end of the texture. So if you've got treble viols that might be a little weaker in sound or a little quieter in sound, you can boost that end of your work to help with that. And it's interesting that the dividing point of the keyboards changed as the century progressed. So largely up until about the interregnum, the dividing point was between middle C and the B below. And then after the restoration, you find it shifts up a tone to between D and middle C sharp. And I think the reason for that is a reflection of the violin coming into consort. So in consort use, you don't much go below the C string on your treble. And similarly, on your violin, you don't go much below the D string. And that's reflected in the way that the keyboards split on the consort organs. And then later in the century, the very last ones to be produced don't have a split at all. And I think that's when we see a reflection of kind of Italian continuo style techniques coming in. Because as I hope to show, the way in which organs were used in consort music is not Italianate. It's not like that sort of dynamic of solo instrument, something quieter accompanying it. It's very much more a balance, very much more a sort of equal partnership. If we have a look at the methods of blowing the organ, we find that there are three ways that generally were used. The Smithfield organ, originally at Hunston, would have had a big contraption behind it which housed the bellows. These are a bit like the sort of bellows you puff your fire with, rather bigger. So they would have been operated by a second person. So it was a two-man job. I say two-man, we'll talk more about men in a moment. But the Hunston bellows were placed behind. Later organs had the bellows incorporated into either the roof or in the later cabinet organs with casework below, down at the bottom. And after the restoration, you often find a pedal is put in here so that the player can provide his own wind, as it were. But the manipulation of these bellows is a really important aspect of the playing, and it's an art, really, which we've lost today. It's very much like a singer and their breathing. So you need to think, where are you going to breathe in, where are you breathing out, to enhance the sort of phrasing, the flow of the music. And whoever was operating the bellows, whether it was the player or an assistant, also had to do the same thing, because you can make or break a performance by blowing badly, so to speak. So it was quite a skill. But not only that, you can also get some expressive nuances in. I don't know if you've ever seen those chaps who play organettos, those sort of medieval organs. You perch them on your knee and you sort of puff with one hand and play the keyboard with your right hand. They can do extraordinary things dynamically and expressively with the bellows. And I suspect that that was also employed to some extent on the consort organ. There is a quote from Roger North where he remarks upon the fact that it's very clever that the organ builders build the pipe so that if you puff harder with the bellows, they don't go up in pitch, as most organs would to some extent. They just get a little bit louder. So this gives us opportunities for slight dynamic changes, and also for things like sforzandos. So I think that, again, this is another area of performance practice that we need to rediscover, because our modern box continuum organs just have an electric fan that provides just a steady, unwavering supply of dead wind, whereas these instruments use live wind provided by a live person. Now, I'm taking a swig of gin because we're about to enter controversial territory, bearing in mind I'm surrounded by viol players, but here goes. Pitch. Now, as I feared, this is not very clear, so let me just explain what you can't see. This is a graph, and this line going across it represents modern concert pitch, A440. And then the invisible lines are quarter tones. So down here, at this level, is A415, so Baroque pitch. And on here, I've plotted the pitch data that can reliably be obtained from some of the surviving organs. There were more I could have added, but these are the really sort of rock-solid ones you can't argue too much with. And I'm grateful to the late Dominic Gwynn for this information. He did a lot of work on these instruments. He knew them in a hands-on way better than anybody really has ever done. His firm also worked on this instrument we'll learn about later. But he extracted this information. Most of these organs have been changed in pitch since the 17th century, but there are ways that you can recover their original pitch data. So we can see, first of all, that none of these organs operated at A415. And we can also see that the majority of them operated higher pitch than modern concert pitch. And as the century progressed from 1600 through to 1700, the general trend rose. I put a sort of general trend, there is a technical term for a general trend line, but I've no idea what it is. going through the middle here, and you can see the sort of general rise, so that by the end of the century, this organ is in the Royal College of Music Museum in London. That's about a third, minor third higher than Baroque pitch. So it raises some interesting questions about how we might perform this music today. Was all consort music performed at higher pitch? Well, you will all have a view on that, and that's a very controversial area which I will not dare tread in. But certainly as far as consorts to the organ are concerned, the evidence that we have does suggest that the pitch for that repertoire was rather higher than it is today. So that could be food for thought. I know some groups are now experimenting with higher pitches, and your opinion on that may vary depending where you're coming from. As far as temperament is concerned, very often when we have a modern box organ, you get something that's like sort of fifth or sixth comma mean tone, so an unequal temperament. But we have evidence from the time that suggests that something rather closer to equal temperament was often used on organs. This is one of many quotes I could have thrown at you, but this is John Pell, who was a mathematician writing about proportion in music. And he's talking about two organs, contrasting them. One, an organ using the Pythagorean scale, so it's perfectly in tune, but in one key only. And he compares it with one which uses a scale which divideth an eighth, an octave, into 12 equal semitones. In other words, equal temperament. And he goes on to say, which division all our viols, lutes, guitars, and the like instruments, string instruments, do follow. And there are a number of other observers, some musical, some scientific, who talk about what appears to be kind of equal temperament being used in keyboard instruments and stringed instruments at this time. Now, the relevance of this really only applies if you start to look at the music itself. So if we go back to the Lestrange manuscripts at Hunston and some of the things that Jenkins wrote for them, you'll see that they do go through some quite abstruse keys. And if you play them using an unequal temperament, to the modern ear at least, it sounds quite painful. I mean, we know that some composers exploited unequal temperaments for expressive means, Bach, B minor, for example, and that was a very important part of the music of the past. But in some of these cases, it really goes beyond that into something that is quite uncomfortable. Now, that presupposes that that is not an effect that they wanted. And of course, there is always the danger of listening with modern ears and thinking, hearing what we want to hear, and not what they wanted to hear. But nevertheless, there does seem to be some evidence to suggest that that equal temperament, or something quite close to it, was often used in these instruments. Now, the consort organ's role in music, consort music, really was developed for most part at court. So Ferrabosco and his contemporaries were using the organ to double string parts. But by the time we get to the 1620s, the late Jacobean period, at the court of first Prince Henry and then Prince Charles, we find ensembles like Coprario's Music at work, where you've got the leading chamber musicians of the time, including Orlando Gibbons as organist. And they start to develop an independent role for the organ in consort. So it's no longer just doubling strings, it's now doing its own thing. It's playing introductions, interludes, and it's adding independent strands to the texture. So if you don't have the organ there, there are embarrassing silences. And that kind of texture was developed as the century progressed. So the court was always an important source, a sort of hotbed of new ideas, which were then percolated out to elsewhere. We don't have, sadly, very much evidence of what the actual court organs were like. This is the only one that we can be certain of as a genuine court organ, and this, unfortunately, we don't know where it is now. It was known as King James's travelling organ, and he had it in a Catholic chapel, a sort of a temporary chapel that he used when he was reviewing his troops. And after that became redundant, my hunch is that the organ builder Renatus Harris took this into his workshop and sort of tarted it up for use in the new Popish chapel, the Catholic chapel that James II had built at Whitehall, and the bills for this work survive. I can't prove it, but I'm fairly confident that this is that organ. And you can see that after Harris's work, it becomes quite an elaborate instrument. Now, these are in fact the same instrument, although pictured at different times, mid-19th century and then in 1924, I think. The odd thing about this, incidentally, is this window arrangement here. And that's one of the clues, I think, that it ended up in that Whitehall chapel. Sash windows on the front of organs was a peculiar phenomenon that occurred very briefly towards the end of the 17th century in London, in organs that were associated with work that was directed by Christopher Wren. And several of the organs in churches that he was dealing with at that time had them. So St Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, there were one or two others in London. And the idea was that whilst there's building work going on, they started to use the buildings for services. But lots of dust going around, of course, which is detrimental to organs. So he had this idea of the sash window. You could close it up, keep the dust out, open it up when you wanted to use it. And here we find it on this consort organ, uniquely. The dates fit very nicely with the period just before the Popish chapel opens. Who knows, I may be wrong about that, but it would be nice to think that that's what it went on to do. It was sold to America in 1924 and lost. My hunch again is I think if it's where I think it is, it's in a warehouse in the Bronx. And I've written to them several times, but they haven't got back to me, so who knows. I'm not going out there to find out. But from the court, the concept of the consort organ began to spread out into those houses and households in the orbit of the court. So here is an early example. This is a Jacobean case at Hatfield House. So this was made for the Cecil family. Apparently it's Cecil and not Cecil. It's like Purcell and not Purcell. Anyway, there it is. It's much more fun to say Cecil, I find. This is an early example. It's been altered rather a lot. So these pipes are not original. It would have been wooden pipes originally. Decorated in this magnificent way by a chap called Roland Bucket. But a good example of what a posh, expensive consort organ would look like in a top quality aristocratic establishment. Gradually they filtered down lower in society. This one is a particular interest to viol players, I guess, insofar as this one was made in 1865 by one of the Dalham family. I think it was Ralph Dalham. And he made it for the Oxford Music School. It's now in Worcester Cathedral. Somebody's come along in the 18th century and given it partly a new case, but this bit in the middle where the pipes are is the original bit, and a lot of the interior of it is original too. And you can see it's a much plainer kind of device. So this is a working organ, and of course it's associated with a lot of that wonderful repertoire that's now held in the various Oxford libraries. And then there's an example of a very small sort of domestic organ that you might find in a lesser household. This one used to be in the Finchcott's collection in Kent, but has now been sold, and I'm not quite sure where it is. Some of them went to France. I'm not sure where this one ended up. Again, probably from the Dalham workshop, because a number of these instruments have characteristics inside them which link them to the same maker. So much for the organs. Let's have a quick look at organists. Things began at the court, as far as the consort organ was concerned, at least in the 17th century. And the court organists were quite a close bunch of people. So the earliest generation, sort of Jacobean, we've got Coprario Gibbons. Gibbons is relative Edward, in fact, taught a number of distinguished organists in his time. And this influence then moved down the generations. So the Gibbonses taught, Christopher Gibbons, Hinkston, Locke. They passed on their knowledge to Purcell. Coprario had some influence on Laws and Jenkins. So you find that this knowledge, stylistic sort of content, was passed down through a fairly closed circle of people, really. And in many cases, organists were almost like a sort of closed shop. They didn't tend to go through the apprenticeship process in quite the same way that other domestic and court musicians did. They seemed to sort of run their own system. But of course, their influence was important insofar as, particularly during the interregnum, they then spread their talents out to the provinces. And I'm sorry you can't really see this terribly well, but here are some of the houses that some of these organists and composers worked at. So we've got Coprario there, worked for the Cecils at Hatfield. We've got Hinkston, who started off at Skipton, and so on. And all of these houses can be proved, with the exception of Ashridge House, but I bet they had one, to have had consort organs available for these musicians to use. And some of them still survive. The ones in colour are the ones that are still there. So at Staunton Harold, for example, although they've changed it into a sort of church organ, originally it was in the house, and that's associated with the Shirley Park books that were put together by Laws when he was young and so on. So we find that this influence gradually spreads down the social scale and into other parts of the country. So we can learn a few things about what organists were. They were invariably men. There's some interesting research going on at Roehampton at the moment into women and the organ in the 17th century, and I'm looking forward to what they find. But I haven't been able to find very many references to women playing the organ at all. Some instruments, as you all know, were sort of recommended for amateurs, lutes and flutes and viols, later the violin, perhaps the virginals. But others were very distinctly professional instruments, and the organ was very much a professional instrument and a sort of manly instrument as well. Many of the organists were from a chorister background, and this is important because choristers' training involved a lot of polyphonic improvisation, initially vocally, and then later on they would apply those same skills to the organ. And a lot of the music that a 17th century organist would play would be made up on the spot and not written down. So improvisation and extemporization were key skills, and very often that was done within polyphonic textures, which is very useful for playing ensembles with strings, as we'll find out. Most of them had a court connection, and if you had a household and you wanted to employ a musician but you could only afford one, very often you would choose an organist because he's really the most useful chap you can have. Many of them played other instruments as well, but an organist can do so much to assist. And many of them enjoyed this sort of privileged position. You've probably seen the inventory of Wilby's room, which looks very comfortable and cosy and rather splendid. Their duties are much as you would expect. I don't know whether you can read this or not, but sort of buying instruments, tuning, composing, arranging music, and so on. But the important one, I think, I'll just point out, is directing the consort. Now, I can see perhaps some viol players might be bristling at the thought of that. It's quite clear from some of the contemporaries, North in particular, talks about the role of the organist sort of beating time and keeping everybody in place and so on. Bearing in mind that this chap is a servant and he's often dealing with people who are way above him on the social scale, it must have been an awkward thing just to have navigated that. But nevertheless, they do appear to have been in charge during consort making at least. And of course today, as an organist in a viol consort, you're stuffed at the back and you have to do what you're told. But it was, well, that's my experience of it anyway. But it was very different then, so that's perhaps something we might like to bear in mind. But in return, you can expect quite a decent time of it. You've got wages, you've got accommodation, you might get your livery, and importantly, you've got time to go off elsewhere, particularly to the court, where many of these composers had a sort of a second life. And they would come back laden with manuscripts of the latest stuff that they would use in their domestic duties. Now, let's look at the repertoire. So, 30 composers are recorded as writing organ parts to consort music. About half of them were professional organists, 2/3 of them operated at the court. Nearly all of them also had domestic roles at one time or other in their career. The repertoire itself falls into 4 main areas. There are polyphonic works, so fantasias, nominés, homophonic dance works, and of course in things like fantasia suites you get a combination of the two. But importantly, you've got these works for solo instruments, and especially 1 or 2 bass viols. You'll have played many of them yourselves, I'm sure. And it's important to remember here that the consort organ's role was not like a continuo instrument, so it's not accompanying the viols, it's interacting on a sort of equal plane with them. So it's very much a sort of partnership rather than a sort of subservient relationship that you find in later sort of continuo contexts. And then there were division-based works. So Simpson, in both his books, encourages the organist to get involved. And it's interesting that he talks about an organist specifically. He doesn't say keyboardist, harpsichordist. He mentions specifically the organist. Now, within all this music, there are 3 things that the organ will generally do. Doubling strings we've touched on. And in the early work, because I think they were looking for this sonority of organ plus strings as a sort of homogeneous sound, these are often found amongst professional players and often at the court. Later on, doubling roles for the organ were found in more amateur contexts, where you are then helping the string players if they're getting lost or they're out of time or whatever. Then, of course, there's the independent contribution to the texture. This is where the organ is doing something that nobody else's does, and this is a very important part of its role. And this is often in polyphonic textures, and often it was improvised. It wasn't written down for you. And then lastly, there are chordal textures, but again, they're often independent. They're still not quite, until you get to the very end of the century, like your typical sort of Italian continuo part. Now, the music that's put in front of you as an organist would fall into three main types: written out organ parts, scores, and basses of one kind or another. The fully written out organ parts, ones that you can just put in front of you and play, are very rare, and they only really occur in amateur contexts where you haven't got a professional organist who could improvise or do all the other things you need to do. So you just sit and read it. But really, it was very rare for a 17th century organist in any context, really, to just simply play what was put in front of them. It almost never happened. You always have to do something to the music in one way or another. So more commonly, you get these, what I call skeletal organ parts, where you get a bass and a treble texture. Jenkins is full of these. And the implication is that they need to be filled out. You need to put something in the middle. And occasionally Jenkins, particularly, will give you a little clue to this, where he'll add a few notes here and there of things that you might not expect the music is doing. So there might be sort of accidentals that appear, or suspensions, or particular entries in instruments that he wants doubled. So the implication of this is that when you get one of these polarized textures, treble and bass, that you need to fill in the middle parts extempore. And often a three-part texture is perfect for playing with violins. You don't need to go sort of full on with fistfuls of chords. 3 parts is often absolutely fine. Organ scores can come in two forms. The open score, where each instrument's on a separate line. Mostly professional organists use these. You could get compressed scores, where everything is crammed onto 2 staves. And very often, these are mistaken as solo organ music, because you can more or less play them as a solo organ piece, except that some of them are impossible to play because there's too many notes at once. So it can be difficult to tell. There are clues that you can use to help you to work out whether they are, in fact, compressed scores. This is a sort of parenthetical thing, so I won't talk too much about it, but you can actually take this idea and take it back in time and look at things that you think might be solo organ music from, say, the Tudor period, and work out that actually these are consort scores or organ parts. So you can discover some lost sort of consort music from solo, what appears to be solo organ music. So I've been having fun doing that recently. And then finally you've got basses, unfigured or figured. Unfigured are very common, and you find them also in polyphonic works. So fantasias could have just a bass, and you contribute to the polyphonic texture. Figured basses were not very common in instrumental consort music until later on. They appeared a little bit earlier in vocal music, and I'm not sure why that is, but there must be a reason for it. So that's what you've got in front of you as an organist. But of course, it's what you do with it that's important. Let's just take a quick look at some examples. So this is a rare example of a written out organ part. This is a bit of Jenkins there, one of his 5-part fantasias. So that's, and you can literally just put that down and play it, but an unusual experience. Here is, what is this? Oh, this is an organ score. Now, how do we know it's an organ score and not just a general score for transmission purposes or whatever? And the clue here is the 6-line stave. So the keyboard stave has 6 lines. Most instrumental music uses 5 staves. It's not an absolute clear and fast distinction, but it's a very useful guide. And again, you would not be expected to play all of this. You would pick out what is useful. So you would usually double the bass line all the way through. You would probably double whatever is playing the highest part, which might not necessarily be the highest treble. And then there might be entries that you might want to pick out, such as you've got some little figure comes in here twice. You might want to include that in your organ part. But you certainly wouldn't really want to play the whole thing. Here is, I think, a compressed organ score. And again, at first sight, you might think, ooh, there's a piece of organ music. And indeed, you could, I suppose, play it as a piece of organ music in a way. But then you realise there are things that just can't be done. There are impossible stretches and things like that. So this is a bit of contrario. And then finally, here is an example of an unfigured bass. So you're met with this sort of thing quite a lot. This is a coranto, so a largely chordal texture. But again, you might find these in polyphonic works as well. There are some manuscripts which give us some nice clues as to sort of performance practice. I couldn't find my photograph, unfortunately, of this, but at the beginning of, this is from the Gibbons double bass Fantasia, somebody, we don't know whether it was Gibbons or not, has jotted in these small notes, which I don't know whether you can see that, an extra sort of polyphonic entry that bridges the gap between the bass entry and then the double bass entry at the bottom. Otherwise, the bass just keeps going for a long time with nothing much happening with it. And the expectation here is that the organ would fill in the texture polyphonically, and somebody's put in a really nicely rendered imitative point there. But normally this sort of thing would have been done on the spot. And as I say, improvising polyphonically was an everyday task for organists, so it wasn't quite as scary as we might find it today. Sometimes when I'm playing with Morris, I practice it. And of course it does go wrong sometimes, and I sometimes see him wince. Morris's wince is almost imperceptible, it's just a millimetre raising of his eyebrow. But I know he's noticed it. And it's because I'm making it up. And Roger North comments on this. He says, that it's a dodgy instrument to play in concerts because if you make a mistake, everybody knows about it. But it didn't matter because you're just playing to your friends. You're just playing in a domestic context. Today, of course, a lot of people are under huge pressure. They're sitting on the stage of Wigmore Hall, or they're live on Radio 3 in tune. Now, if you want to improvise polyphonically in that context, you're a brave person. I wouldn't fancy it, but that's the kind of thing they would have done there. The point of this slide is completely lost by the terrible fact that we've got a bit too much light. But what I've tried to show here is the fact that in this Jenkins Fantasia, Jenkins has written some suggestions out here, and he's drawn them from the texture. So he's got the bass line doubled, he's got the top sounding part, which in this case is treble 2, and then he takes little bits which are highlighted in yellow but completely invisible, sorry about that, to fill in the gaps, or most of them anyway. But there is still more that you could do with this as an organist, so if we move on to the next one it might be a little bit clearer. My suggestion here was, because we're in a 6-part texture, you can use a little bit more organ. You can go up to perhaps 4 parts, so I've filled in the texture a little bit more here. And there are other moments when you can let rip a bit more as an organist as well. For example, the last chord. Or if you've got, sometimes you get those sort of declamatory, homophonic passages, then you can perhaps add a few fingers to your chordal thing. But actually less is always more in consort organ playing. And so restraint, highly recommended. And it all adds up to this general principle, which you may be familiar with, this quote from North. He says the organist should be perpetually observing the emphatic places, the important bits in the music, to fill, forbear, or adorn. And by that he means filling, means adding to the texture, filling in these missing parts in the middle, filling in the textures. Forbear means kind of pulling back, subtracting from it. If you're using an organ score, you don't play everything. And adorning means improvising the material. It might be inner parts, it could be divisions if it's that kind of piece. It could be braces, ornamentation. And this is another interesting one. When I'm playing this kind of music, it is just overwhelmingly tempting to ornament it all the time, because the solo organ music for both virginals and harpsichord and organ of this period is wildly ornamented. You will have seen this. And when you play in consort, do you ornament or not? I find it's just impossible not to, really, because it feels so wrong. Which raises the question, should the viols ornament as well? Now, I'll leave that to you experts to answer that one. But I did read an article recently by somebody, I forget who it was, I should have looked it up, who said, in 10 years' time we'll be kicking ourselves that we don't ornament in viol music. Who knows? But certainly as an organist, I would say it really feels as if it needs to be. And there are some interesting contrasts with church choir accompaniment here. Sometimes if you get in, say, a verse anthem, you'll get a solo organ passage, and suddenly out of the blue it will be liberally ornamented, splattered with ornaments, and then it will stop, and it will continue without them. And there are two ways of looking at it, I suppose. One would be to say the organ only ornaments when it's playing on its own, or it could be seen as the organ it's very especially important that the organ ornaments during these solo passages, and this is exactly how to do it. And the rest of the time you can ornament as you might normally do, just by making it up. Which of those is the correct approach? I don't know, but it's one to think about. Now, This is one of the most famous quotes about the organ in ensemble work. Peter used it in the title of his groundbreaking article all those years ago, and it's from Thomas Mace, Music's Monument. And he's talking about consort playing, and he says, the organ, its role, evenly, softly, and sweetly, according to all. And I reckon this is one of the most misinterpreted statements that has ever been written about the organ, because it leads us to think, softly and sweetly, the organ sort of shoved at the back doing what it's told. Not a bit of it. You have to put it in context. Now, Mace, as you know, if you've read Music's Monument, was fond of a diatribe. You get on his high horse and rant, and it's hugely entertaining. In this case, he's ranting about the music meetings in Cambridge after the Restoration, when the treble viol is going out and the violin is coming in, and all these amateur players are rocking up with their new violins, and they're playing really loudly and badly, and it's ruining the balance of the consort. So you get this very top-heavy sort of sound, which he's complaining about. And he's held up as the ideal, the old consorts. No one part was an impediment. Each part amplified and heightened the other. And the organ's role, if we look at the meaning of these words from dictionaries of the time, we find that evenly, it's nothing to do with sort of nice soft stuff. It's all to do with equality. Evenly meant equal to, the same amount as. So an even number is a number you can split into two equal numbers, like 4, but not like 3. So the organ's role is in balance with the viols, not in subservience to them. Softly can mean quietly, of course. We see in manuscripts, sometimes you see the indication soft. But in this context, I think he means not too loudly, not overdoing it, not like those dreadful violins. Sweetly is pretty much meaningless because you can apply it to so many things. It just means nice in modern parlance. So I don't think we can read anything about sugary and saccharine and sort of sickly and quiet and subservient into that. But according is the important one. Balancing, agreeing, in proportion. That's what the word meant then. And that really is the key to what the consort organ should be doing in a consort context. It should be an equal partner to the viols and not a secondary one. Now, we finish off perhaps by looking at one or two other little tidbits from various writers. And, Mace kind of underlines this point a little bit later on. He says the organ should be equally heard to all, but especially to the performers. And if you can't hear an organ, you cannot well perform. Note that. Lots of nuggets from Roger North, and I talk about them to some extent in the book, so more there if you want to look one day. But there are some interesting little tidbits in social music, by which he means family, sort of consort making. During the whole sonata, the basso continuo should not cease. So in between movements of, say, a fantasia suite, the implication here is that the organ would sort of noodle in between the movements until the players are ready, and then off you go again. And later when he's talking about occasions where audiences are present, and I'm always very careful about using these modern words, out of context, but in this case he was talking about audience, such as at a music meeting. The through bass should never cease, for that holds the audience in attention. They'd all start talking if you stop the music. So that might be one to incorporate in your concerts. There was this business here of exploring the key before you start to play. So he describes this at some length. There are a number of parallels to this from continental sources as well, but the idea here, he gives an example of it, is that before you start to play, the organist will sort of get into the key by just noodling away a little bit. It's a bit like those players of the sitar, who explore the scale for half an hour before the piece begins. So it's a sort of condensed version of that. Later in the 18th century, solo keyboard players employed it as preluding. But it's quite interesting to see that it was done in consort music as well. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that time is going on when we must give a moment for a question. So I finish with this. Does anyone know what this is? Answer came there none. It's a gauntlet. If I had a gauntlet, I would now throw it down in front of you, because there is a challenge here. We saw at the beginning of this talk that just 2 people had ever played with a genuine 17th century consort organ in in ensemble music, and I'm delighted to hear about it. Peter, where was it? What did you...
Well, I wasn't playing the bar, I played the organ. I don't know myself.
Oh, right.
I wasn't playing. Sorry, 1771 in Nottingham.
Ah, yes.
In Fantasia Suite.
Excellent. It's a very rare thing to hear. And part of the reason for that is that there are practical obstacles to it, one of which is that pitch problem I talked about. Not all viol players want to take off their strings and put newer ones on to get up there into that sort of pitch. So it's very rare to hear these instruments used in the context for which they were intended. And I don't think, as far as I know, again, Peter might be able to correct me, but I don't think there are any recordings. Are there commercial recordings of this repertoire with the genuine...
Well, we did, I used my concert organ is Gerson Winox 2, which is a box organ, but it's scaled exactly as you were describing.
Yes.
The recording of Jenkins, we made that into assistants, and the recording of Gibbons and Lupo.
Excellent. It is, if I may say so though, a reproduction. And I'm sure it is very excellent. But what I'm really thinking about is the real thing. I don't think anybody really has done very much with the real thing, and yet there are a number of these instruments out there just waiting to be used. And my gauntlet is to some of you who play professionally, here is an excellent opportunity for a USP for your next recording, to employ English repertoire with a genuine English consort organ. Next year I'm hoping to run a workshop for a day in conjunction with BIOS, that's the British Institute of Organ Studies. And an organ has just been restored by the chaps who prepared this organ. And there's some manuscripts that are associated with it. It was from New College, Oxford, and Richard Goodson was organist there when it was around. So there's the Goodson bequest you may be familiar with. So we're hoping to sort of reconstruct some of that music. It's Christopher Gibbons and Purcell. And bring this kind of thing back to life. But there is a big opportunity, I think, a bit of a lacuna, a hole to fill if one can perhaps think about ways to get these old instruments going again. Because I think you'll find that they are much more satisfactory to work with than the modern box continuo organ. Anyway, I better stop waffling at that point, but I don't know whether anyone wants to ask questions. Roy's hand was first, it was excellent.
I've often noticed you have an organ part which is just the treble and the bass, and I think I'm supposed to be improvised, so God knows what, because you have no idea. When it gets to the final chord, it's a 5-note chord.
Yes.
And I think, why?
Yes, it is odd, isn't it? And the last chord is one of those moments where you can sort of splash down as many notes as you like. I think that seems to have been a thing. Yeah, but I mean, before that, if you compare, for example, Jenkins's treble and bass texts with those that he wrote out in full, and it's interesting because, I mean, Andrew will know more about this than me, but we don't know of Jenkins as a keyboard player particularly. We know he played violin and violin, lute and so on. But he obviously was very familiar with the keyboard because he writes excellent organ parts when he puts his mind to it. And if you compare those with those sort of textures you're talking about, fairly modest 3-part textures are the norm. And it's only at extreme moments that you get walloping great chords at the end of things. So it was used with discretion, I think.
I think I'd rather see Matthew with Cricket wrong, but the sole source of copper areas and physical suites that has organ parts is great for me. You put copper areas in organs, which find you
No, well, I suppose in the sense that he wrote for the organ, probably not so much that he was an organist. Yes, no, absolutely right. But a lot of these players, I mean, Laws is another example, although his brother said he could play any instrument that he took his mind to brilliantly. We don't really know him as an organist, but certainly he could write very good organ parts. He also wrote some very odd organ parts, but that was for different reasons, because the organ parts originate in a different sort of role. They were sort of sketches for the piece, which then, rather than writing a proper organ part, you can imagine he just sort of dumps this on the organist and says, right, do something with that. So there are exceptions, but yes, you're right about Copperari. He wasn't, again, one of those who was known as an organist particularly. Yes?
David, in sacred music, in organ parts,
yes.
You get immense variety for the same piece. So in Durham part, a section which will have just the continuum at the top and the bottom. In another manuscript, we'll have refilled out.
Yes.
And then in the chorus part, you might but in other manuscripts it's all together. And I just can't get my head around what that tells us. Does the same happen in consort as well? Do you get that same variety between sources?
Absolutely you do, yes. So you might get just an unfigured bass from early in its inception. You might then find yourself dealing with the score of the same work and then something else, from later on. So there are these variant versions, and which one do you choose? If you're an editor of a volume of music, it's tricky enough for the viol parts, but for the organ part you've got these wildly different things which represent the evolution of the work in different texture, different contexts and different times. So which one do you choose for the organ part? And not an easy answer to that question, but one thing that is just starting to come through are these editions that are available electronically, where you can choose what sort of editorial input there is. So you can either see a facsimile, or you can see a modern transcription of the original manuscript, or you can have different levels of editorial intervention, or you can choose the same work at different points in its progress. So that sort of thing might help us. But of course it requires input. You can't just sort of sit there and play this. You've got to think about it. But my suggestion would be that actually it would benefit us hugely, as keyboard players particularly, to do think about it a bit more, not just to rely on editorial editions, excellent though they are, in many ways. So yes, good point. Hello, yes.
Quick question on the idea that unfigured bases were used by organs. I think that unfigured bases were associated particularly with lutes and fiolas. You see this very clearly, and you'll know this better than me. Jenkins' Lyra copies, I think the Oxford sources, written a harpsichord part and the viola part.
They do.
Unfigured base.
Yes.
That's fairly typical in my opinion.
It is, and because it raises a further question as to which instrument should you use, because some sources very clearly say consort to the organ, and others you're left to choose. Now, would you use a harpsichord? I would imagine in practice, if you didn't have an organ to hand, then you would use something else, in practical terms. I think if you had the option to use an organ, that would be your first go-to place. But some sources are quite specific about it. If you think about the North sources from Kirtling Hall, there you find indications to the organ, to the harpsichord, not to the organ. So sometimes they can be quite specific about it. But yes, there is a lot of overlap between instruments that play sort of polyphonically, and you need to look at it quite hard to decide that it really is an organ part if it doesn't specifically say so. So that is a danger to watch out for. Sir?
Yes, you were discussing the mechanics of the organ.
Yes.
Various levels.
Yes.
I just wondered whether that was a contribution to Victorian harmonium.
Well, if you play a genuine harmonium as opposed to things like American organs, which are simpler, harmoniums are very much like that. They are responsive to every nuance of your feet, and they're jolly difficult to play. There are sort of French ones knocking around that you use for that Rossini, Petit Mass Solennel. And playing that mass part, there's a thing that removes this effect, but if you play it as it should be played, it's absolutely horrendous experience because it responds to every little movement of your feet. The sort of Victorian harmonium you find in your local village church is usually not that kind of instrument, so it's much more forgiving. But yes, you can see evidence of it in the harmoniums. But it's a lost art, and it's not something that applies so much to church organs, which tend to be rather bigger, and there you put some naughty schoolboy at the back who's pumping away for dear life. And there the nuances kind of get worn, sort of smoothed out in the way that the wind is supplied to the organ. But on these smaller organs where it goes directly in and isn't sort of stored somewhere else first, then yes, they're very sensitive to it. And it adds a whole new dimension to the way the instrument sounds, and you very rarely get the chance of
that begs the question of how well the pumper knew the music, because
exactly.
He's stuck behind, you can't see anything.
No, and it's a very good question, because how did that work? It's all right if you're playing yourself, but it gives you another thing to think about on top of everything. But you can't just get any sort of stable boy in to start doing this. You've got to have someone who knows what they're doing. Another interesting question, not quite related to that, but is where did the music go? Now, this has puzzled me for a long time. Many of these organs now have music desks on the front of them, but in many cases they were added later. And so you might think, well, you just stand it behind the keyboard, but there's no space for the music to go. So what did they do? Did they have a music stand to the left and play like this. I don't have the answer to that. There's a good thesis for the history of the music stand for somebody if you fancy giving it a go. But there are lots of strange questions like that. Just simple things that they would do every day that they never bothered to record.
Well, also on logistics, do you have any thoughts about where the viol players sat in relation to the keyboard player?
Another interesting, because you see, here I am playing my organ, and they normally stood against a wall because the back of them is undecorated. So you're playing here. Where are the viol? Are they to the side of you? Are they behind you? It's very difficult to know. And Roger North actually said at one point, wouldn't it be a good idea if somebody were to make a really little organ that you could just stick on a table, and everyone would play around you in kind of almost like a table book format, like as Virginal sometimes we use, which it would have been a good idea really, but nobody seemed to have thought of doing it. So again, you're directing an ensemble which is to the side of you or behind you, and yes, it raises lots of questions. I don't know.
Doesn't Mace actually have his organist sitting facing the viol players?
Mace,
Seated around the organ?
yes.
It is a table as well.
It is. Mace, he thought invented, in fact, the idea had been around for a long time, but he didn't know, a table organ. So it's basically, it looks like a dining room table, but inside all the pipes, keyboard at one end, and then there are music desks which open up around it, and so the various players can sit around it. And it was a brilliant idea. But as far as we know, he was the only person who actually built such. I think he built two of them, but nobody thought of it, and it's bonkers really. There are similar sorts of instruments you find on the continent, but they did different things with them.
I say, by the way, that Dominic Gwynn, one of his last projects was to actually build the Mace organ. I'm not sure if it ever happened.
I don't think it did. I was writing to him up until the point where he got very ill, and he said it was one thing. I think the money ran out. Whoever it was who was buying it or sponsoring it, I think it dried up, but it's probably still there, so maybe something to. But yes, he was certainly hoping to do that. Yeah. Another question.
I think your point that there's nothing like musically with or playing on a historic instrument, but you know that it's making this kind of organ?
There is only one firm that I know of who've made anything really quite like it, and that's the firm we've just been talking about, Goetz and Gwynn. They specialise in sort of restoration of historic organs. They also make new organs in historical styles. And they have produced a couple. One went to Germany many years ago, and I don't know what happened to it. They built another one for a Belgian group, Lacheron, you may have come across them. And they use theirs in some of their recordings. It's a slightly odd way sometimes. They need to read the book, I think. But what we really need is what Peter was talking about, is an organ that is voiced in that way, but that is as convenient as an organ that you can shove in the boot of your Volvo or whatever to take out, and that would be really helpful. You know.
That's what mine was designed to fit in a Ford Escort van.
Gosh, even smaller. But yeah, no, so an instrument like that, I would have thought there's a real market for that. Yeah. Yes.
What would the pipes make?
It varies somewhat. Traditionally, very old organ pipes in Britain, in England, were oak. And then later on, by the time you get to the 17th century, you find the bottom part of the pipe, the sort of business end that produces the sound, was often oak, and the top was pine or other softwood. And then eventually the whole thing was softwood. So depending on the period, it sort of changed.
And would it be continental pipe?
I don't know. That's a good question. I know some pine was obtained from the Baltic for those sort of things, but I don't know. So,
This indication that most consort music from a certain date would have had, but an organ wouldn't be expected.
no.
The Bird, for example, expected an organ from this consort.
He might have done, depending, but certainly not all consort music would have involved the organ. There's clearly some consort music that definitely doesn't want the organ because they specifically say so. So I don't think one can assume that a piece of consort music should have an organ in it. But I think there are certainly some pieces of consort music that have lost their organ sources, but we can make a fair guess that they should have an organ with them. They don't currently, so there's some work to be done there. Bird, well, if you go back into the 16th century, you find evidence of the organ working with other instruments. But it's still very much in the early stages of finding out how that operated. So one can't be definitive about it, but in some contexts, it's quite likely that they might have done. He said in a very sort of evasive way. But yes, it's a possibility, yes.
Well, there you get into that area you were talking about pieces that appear to be organ music, but which could be viol consort music. I mean, the
Yes.
Bird 5-part canon fantasia appears both in sets of parts and as a keyboard piece. So whether they were ever played together is one question.
The organ parts, I think, Simon, for at least one of the 6-part fantasias, which were published in an anthology. I've got it at home, published in an anthology of solo organ music. The editor obviously thinking it was a solo.
Yes.
Solo piece, which it could be. I mean, it could be played.
Yes. And it works the other way round. We're getting a bit off topic here, but in another life I play in an early music ensemble, and we, dare I say the word, we play crumhorns sometimes. And there are some interesting keyboard works, or what appear to be keyboard works, from the Tudor period, that if you transcribe them for crumhorns, work perfectly. So does that mean they're crumhorn pieces? Possibly, I don't know. But it's fun to play around with these sort of transcriptions or transferences of text to textures.
Well, I think I should just say, by the way, that Robert Thompson and I are working on the revised Volume 31 Personal Society edition, which used to be called Fantasias and Miscellaneous Instrumental Music, and now will be called Consort Music. And Robert has written a very good organ part for Fantasias.
Excellent.
The rationale from that is that we think that Purcell following Locke and probably Tompkins before them and Gibbons would have played extempore from their full scores accompanying consort music. So I don't know whether Barclays will want to play Purcell Fantasias with the organ part. And the reason why we've done it is that it's very, I know from bitter experience, it's very hard to improvise the part for Purcell Fantasias.
Yes, I can imagine that, yes. And the sonatas are also interesting because there the organ part is a figured bass, and it's a highly detailed figured bass in Purcell. And there are some odd things that happen in it. You get strange clashes with the strings, and you think, ouch, should that? And I've never been sure, but actually in my own mind I am sure, that he did mean it like that, because he was that sort of chap. He was quite meticulous about it. But a lot of people omit these clashes in performance, and you're waiting for the lovely scrunchy moment. It doesn't come, and you think, oh, that's a pity. So yes, it'd be interesting to see those when they come out. Well, I think my grilling is finally over. So anyway, well, thank you very much for listening, and I would encourage you to explore the wonderful world of the consort organ, buy my book, and look forward to seeing some of the fruits of that anon. Thank you.
Thank you, David.